There is a strange pattern that rarely gets spoken aloud. In many families, chaos does not hunt the loudest voice or the most aggressive soul. It watches, it waits, and then it chooses the one who is gentle, the one who listens more than they speak, the one who listens more than they speak, the one who forgives before being asked. Kindness, in these spaces, is not celebrated, it is studied, measured, and slowly marked as a liability. The kind one never announces their strength. They carry it in restraint, in patience, in the ability to feel deeply without turning cruel, and that is precisely why the atmosphere begins to shift around them. Tension appears without explanation. Misunderstandings multiply, small actions are questioned, intentions are rewritten, and suddenly the room feels colder when they enter. Not because they changed, but because their presence exposes what others work hard to hide. What unfolds next is not accidental, it is a quiet campaign. The kind one is tested to see how much they will tolerate, how much they will excuse, how long they will keep offering peace while being handed discomfort. Each moment of silence is mistaken for permission, each act of empathy is misread as surrender. And the more compassion they show, the bolder the pressure becomes. This is the truth few are prepared to face in broken systems. Kindness is not seen as virtue. It is seen as something to be controlled. Because kindness carries clarity, and clarity is dangerous to anything built on fear, denial, or unspoken power. Tonight, we are not here to harden the heart of the gentle. We are here to expose the force that targets them, and to understand why the moment the kind one awakens, everything begins to change. Why kindness becomes a threat in broken families. In healthy families, kindness circulates freely. It is mirrored, respected, and protected. But in broken family systems, kindness does something dangerous. It disrupts the invisible order. These systems are not held together by love or mutual understanding. They survive on unspoken rules, emotional hierarchies, and quiet control. When one person enters that space with genuine empathy, honesty, and moral clarity, they unintentionally expose the cracks. They do not accuse anyone. They do not challenge openly. Yet their very way of being asks a question the system cannot answer. Why does decency feel so uncomfortable here? The kind one becomes a threat because they do not need manipulation to exist. They don't thrive on dominance, fear, or guilt. Their strength is internal, rooted in conscience rather than approval. In dysfunctional environments, this independence is unsettling. It reminds others of choices they avoided, integrity they compromised, and wounds they buried instead of healing. And rather than confronting those truths, the system reacts the only way it knows how, by targeting the source of discomfort. Kindness carries an unspoken authority. It doesn't shout, it doesn't compete, it doesn't perform. It simply is. And that quiet presence destabilizes power structures built on emotional confusion. When the kind one listens instead of escalating, forgives instead of retaliating, and reflects instead of reacting, they refuse to play the game that keeps dysfunction alive. This refusal is not perceived as maturity. It is perceived as defiance. Broken families often confuse kindness with weakness because they rely on emotional survival tactics learned over years, sometimes generations. Control feels safer than connection. Familiar pain feels more predictable than growth. So when the kind one shows compassion without expectation, it creates a sense of exposure. Suddenly, the old methods don't work as effectively. Guilt loses its grip. Fear no longer guarantees obedience. And the system begins to feel its authority slipping. This is why the attacks rarely begin loudly. They start subtly. Tone changes. Intentions are questioned. Innocent mistakes are magnified. The kind one is labeled too sensitive, too emotional, or too idealistic. These labels are not observations. They are defenses. They are attempts to reframe kindness as a flaw so it can be dismissed rather than respected. Because acknowledging the strength of kindness would require self-examination, and that is the one thing the system avoids at all costs. At the core of this dynamic is fear, not fear of the kind one doing harm, but fear of them seeing clearly. Clarity is the greatest threat to dysfunction. The kind one notices inconsistencies. They sense emotional undercurrents. They feel when something is off, even if no one names it. And while they may stay silent, their awareness alone disrupts the illusion that everything is normal. In families built on denial, awareness feels like betrayal. The system responds by isolating the kind one emotionally, not always physically, but psychologically. Conversations shift when they speak. Their experiences are minimized. Their concerns are reframed as overreactions. Slowly, the message becomes clear. Your kindness is welcome only if it remains convenient. The moment it demands honesty, balance, or accountability, it becomes unacceptable. What makes the kind one especially vulnerable is their hope. They believe understanding can fix things. They assume empathy will eventually be reciprocated. They give the benefit of the doubt long after evidence suggests otherwise. This hope is not foolish, it is human. But in broken systems, it is exploited. The kind one is relied upon to absorb tension, smooth conflicts, and carry emotional labor without recognition. Their role becomes essential yet undervalued. Over time, kindness stops being seen as a choice and starts being treated as an obligation. The kind one is expected to forgive faster, tolerate more, and ask for less. And if they hesitate, if they express exhaustion or pain, the response is swift and dismissive. Suddenly, they are accused of changing, of becoming difficult, of disrupting harmony, when in reality they are simply no longer sacrificing themselves to preserve an unhealthy peace. This is the moment the threat becomes undeniable, because kindness that learns to protect itself transforms into something powerful. It gains boundaries, it gains discernment, and that evolution terrifies systems that depend on access without accountability. The family demon, so to speak, does not fear kindness when it is endless. It fears kindness when it becomes selective. The truth is, the kind one was never the problem, they were the mirror. And broken systems hate mirrors because they reflect without mercy, without exaggeration, without malice. Just truth. Calm, steady, unavoidable truth. That is why kindness becomes a target, not because it is weak, but because it is strong enough to survive without corruption. Understanding this changes everything. It removes the shame the kind one was taught to carry. It reframes their pain not as personal failure, but as systemic resistance. And most importantly, it marks the beginning of a shift from unconscious endurance to conscious self-respect. Because the moment the kind one realizes their kindness is powerful, the system loses its favorite illusion, and once that illusion breaks, nothing operates the same again. How the kind one is slowly turned into the scapegoat. It never begins with cruelty. That would be too obvious, too easy to name. In broken family systems, the transformation of the kind one into the scapegoat is a slow, calculated drift so gradual that by the time it is visible, it already feels normal. At first, the kind one is praised for being understanding, patient, reliable. They are the one who listens when others vent, the one who mediates tension, the one who mediates tension, the one who absorbs discomfort so peace can be maintained. This role feels meaningful at the start. It feels like trust. But slowly, without ceremony, it becomes expectation. The shift happens when responsibility begins to slide downhill. Emotional weight that others refuse to carry is quietly placed on the kind one's shoulders. If there is tension in the home, they are asked to smooth it over. If there is conflict, they are encouraged to be the bigger person. If someone reacts harshly, the kind one is urged to understand why. This framing is subtle but powerful. Harm is explained, while hurt is dismissed. Over time, the kind one learns that their feelings are negotiable, but others' behaviors are fixed. Scapegoating thrives on imbalance. The kind one is singled out not because they cause problems, but because they are least likely to retaliate. They hesitate to defend themselves aggressively. They search for meaning rather than blame. They internalize questions instead of throwing accusations outward. This inward orientation makes them the safest container for collective discomfort. When something goes wrong, pointing toward the kind one feels easier than confronting the real source of instability. Language becomes the weapon of choice. Words like dramatic, oversensitive, or always emotional are introduced, not as insults, but as explanations. These labels serve a strategic purpose. They reframe the kind one's reactions as flaws rather than responses. Once this narrative settles, any attempt by the kind one to speak up is filtered through it. Their concerns are no longer evaluated on merit, they are pre-dismissed as part of the problem. The family system begins to unconsciously rely on this distortion. It creates a strange relief. If the kind one is the issue, then no one else has to change. Patterns can continue unexamined. Harm can remain unnamed. Accountability can be postponed indefinitely. The scapegoat role becomes a psychological shortcut, an efficient way to preserve the status quo without addressing its cost. What makes this especially damaging is the kind one's participation in the illusion, at least at first. They question themselves. They replay conversations. They wonder if they really are asking for too much, feeling too deeply, expecting too much fairness. This self-doubt is not a weakness. It is a byproduct of conscience. But in this environment, conscience is turned against itself. Reflection becomes rumination. Empathy becomes self-erasure. As time passes, the accusations grow more abstract. The kind one is no longer blamed for specific actions, but for atmospheres, moods, and outcomes beyond their control. If the family feels tense, it must be because the kind one is distant. If someone is unhappy, it must be because the kind one set a tone. This vagueness is intentional. It keeps the target constantly off balance, unable to defend against something that has no clear shape. Scapegoating also requires an audience. Others may not openly agree, but silence functions as consent. The kind one notices this absence of defense and feels it deeply. They begin to realize that their role is not to be understood, but to be used as an emotional release valve. When pressure builds, it is redirected toward them so the system can breathe again. Their pain becomes the price of collective comfort. Yet the most insidious aspect is how kindness is rewritten as obligation. The kind one is expected to tolerate more because they always have. Their past generosity is used as evidence against them. If they say no, they are accused of changing. If they withdraw, they are labeled cold. The system resents the idea that kindness might have limits, because limits imply choice and choice threatens control. Eventually, the kind one reaches a breaking point, not through explosion, but through exhaustion. They grow quieter, less expressive, more guarded. And instead of concern, the system responds with accusation. You've become difficult. You're not the same anymore. These statements reveal the truth. The kindness that once served everyone else is missed, not the person themselves. The scapegoat role collapses the moment awareness enters. When the kind one begins to see the pattern, something shifts internally. The shame loses its grip. The confusion starts to clear. They realize they were not singled out for being flawed, but for being functional. Not for being weak, but for being safe to blame. This realization is destabilizing to the system because it removes the emotional supply that scapegoating depends on. From this point forward, the dynamic changes. The kind one may still care, still feel deeply, but they no longer carry what was never theirs. They stop explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. They step out of the role without announcing it, and in doing so, they expose the truth that was hidden all along. The problem was never the scapegoat. It was the system that needed one. And once that need is exposed, the family demon loses one of its most effective disguises: the silent war against your empathy. Empathy is not merely an emotion. It is a form of perception. It allows a person to sense what is unspoken, to recognize tension before it erupts, to feel truth even when it is carefully hidden behind polite words and practiced roles. In healthy environments, empathy creates safety and understanding, but in broken family systems, empathy becomes dangerous. Not because it harms, but because it sees. And anything that sees too clearly threatens structures built on avoidance, denial, and emotional control. The silent war against empathy begins the moment the kind one's emotional awareness starts disrupting the comfort of others. They notice when words do not match actions. They feel when affection is conditional. They sense when harmony is performative rather than real. They may not confront these inconsistencies openly, but their responses change. They pause, they hesitate, they no longer play along as easily. And that pause alone is enough to trigger resistance. Rather than addressing what empathy reveals, the system works to neutralize it. The kind one is encouraged, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly, to stop reading into things, to let it go, to not take everything so seriously. On the surface, this sounds like advice. In reality, it is training. Training to disconnect from inner signals. Training to distrust emotional intelligence. Training to abandon perception in favor of convenience. Because an empathetic person who trusts themselves is difficult to manipulate, this is where the war becomes psychological rather than obvious. Empathy is reframed as weakness. Sensitivity is portrayed as instability. Depth is labeled as excess. The kind one is made to feel that their ability to feel deeply is a flaw to be corrected rather than a strength to be protected. Over time, this messaging seeps inward. They begin to censor themselves, they soften their reactions, they doubt their instincts. Not because those instincts are wrong, but because trusting them has become costly. What the system truly fears is not empathy itself, but what empathy eventually leads to: accountability. An empathetic person understands cause and effect. They recognize patterns. They see how unresolved pain spills outward. And while they may initially excuse this behavior, empathy has a limit. At some point, understanding turns into clarity, and clarity is incompatible with denial. So the system escalates its efforts. Emotional honesty is discouraged. Conversations are redirected. When the kind one expresses concern, it is brushed aside or reframed as negativity. When they express hurt, it is minimized or compared to someone else's suffering. This constant redirection sends a clear message: your inner world is inconvenient. And slowly, the kind one learns to keep it to themselves. The cost of suppressing empathy is profound. The kind one begins to feel disconnected not only from others, but from themselves. Emotional exhaustion sets in. Confusion replaces confidence. They wonder why they feel drained after interactions that appear calm on the surface. They struggle to explain the heaviness they carry because nothing overtly harmful seems to be happening. This is the quiet violence of emotional invalidation, pain without permission to name it. Yet even under pressure, empathy does not disappear. It goes underground, it becomes watchful, it gathers information. The kind one may grow quieter, but internally they are observing more than ever. They notice who benefits from their silence. They see how quickly peace returns when they suppress discomfort. They recognize that harmony is being purchased with their emotional absence. This realization is unsettling because it exposes the transaction at the heart of the system. Empathy is welcome only when it serves others. Compassion is praised only when it demands nothing in return. The moment empathy asks for reciprocity, for honesty, for care, for mutual respect, it becomes a threat. And threats must be contained. The silent war reaches its peak when the kind one begins to emotionally detach, not out of bitterness, but out of self-preservation. They stop over-explaining. They stop volunteering emotional labor. They stop trying to heal what they did not break. This shift is often met with confusion or subtle accusation. You've changed. You're distant. These statements reveal the truth. Empathy was never valued for the person, it was valued for the service it provided. What the system does not anticipate is that empathy, once reclaimed, becomes discerning. The kind one does not lose their compassion, they refine it. They learn where it is safe and where it is exploited. They begin to understand that empathy without boundaries is not virtue, it is vulnerability without protection. And with this understanding comes quiet strength. The war ends not with confrontation, but with clarity. The kind one no longer needs others to validate what they feel. They trust their perception. They honor their emotional responses as data, not defects. And in doing so, they remove themselves from the battlefield entirely. A system that depends on their emotional participation suddenly feels exposed and unstable. This is the moment the demon loses leverage, because empathy that is grounded, self-respecting, and selective cannot be weaponized. It cannot be guilted into silence. It cannot be shamed into submission. It simply observes, chooses, and steps back. And when empathy is no longer available for misuse, the system is forced to confront something it has avoided for a long time: itself. Why setting boundaries feels like betrayal to them. In broken family systems, boundaries are not understood as acts of self-respect. They are interpreted as acts of rebellion. When the kind one finally begins to protect their emotional space, the reaction is rarely curiosity or concern. It is shock. Confusion quickly hardens into accusation. Because in a system that has grown comfortable accessing someone without permission, the first no feels like a personal attack. For a long time, the kind one's openness created a false sense of entitlement. Their availability, patience, and willingness to absorb discomfort were mistaken for permanence. Others grew accustomed to leaning on them without checking the weight, venting without responsibility, and crossing emotional lines without consequence. None of this was negotiated, it simply evolved. So when boundaries appear, they disrupt an arrangement that was never consciously agreed upon but deeply relied upon. This is why boundary setting triggers such strong emotional responses. It exposes dependence that was never acknowledged. It reveals how much of the family's stability was built on one person's silence, flexibility, and forgiveness. And rather than confronting that imbalance, the system reframes the boundary as cruelty. You're being selfish. You changed. You're abandoning us. These statements are not reflections of reality, they are expressions of loss of access. The sense of betrayal comes from a distorted narrative that the kind one's role was to be endlessly accommodating. Any deviation from that role is perceived as a violation of an unspoken contract. The irony is that this contract was never mutual. It did not guarantee care, respect, or emotional safety in return. It guaranteed only expectation. And when expectation is challenged, those who benefited most feel the most threatened. Boundaries also dismantle illusion. They force clarity where ambiguity once protected dysfunction. When the kind one says, "I'm not comfortable with this," or "I need space," they introduce accountability into a system that survived by avoiding it. Suddenly, behaviors must be examined, intentions questioned, patterns acknowledged. This is deeply unsettling to those who relied on emotional fog to maintain control. The family's response often follows a predictable pattern. First comes disbelief, surely this is temporary. Then comes precious subtle reminders of obligation, history, and loyalty. When that fails, guilt is deployed, past sacrifices are listed, roles are invoked. The kind one is reminded of who they used to be, as if growth were a moral failure. All of this serves one purpose, to pull them back into compliance. What makes this especially painful is that the kind one often feels guilty for needing boundaries at all. They were conditioned to prioritize harmony over honesty, others' comfort over their own limits. So when they finally speak up, they do so quietly, cautiously, hoping to be understood. But broken systems do not listen for understanding, they listen for weakness, and any hesitation is used as leverage. Boundaries feel like betrayal to them because they signal independence. They mark the end of emotional entitlement. They say, "I am not an extension of your needs. I am a separate person with my own limits." This separation is intolerable to systems that blur identities to maintain control. Individuality threatens cohesion built on dependency rather than mutual respect. As boundaries hold, the system's behavior often escalates, not into overt hostility, but into narrative revision. The kind one is recast as distant, ungrateful, or difficult. Their motives are questioned. Their character is subtly undermined. This is not accidental. It is an attempt to preserve the old story where the kind one's compliance was proof of love, and their resistance must therefore mean rejection. But boundaries do something remarkable. They reveal who valued the person and who valued the access. Those who truly cared may struggle, but they adapt. They ask questions. They respect the new limits. Those invested in control do not. They push harder. They test. They punish with withdrawal or disappointment. And in that contrast, truth becomes unmistakable. For the kind one, this phase is emotionally taxing. Holding boundaries requires tolerating others' discomfort without rushing to fix it. It demands faith in one's own worth when external approval fades. It asks for stillness in the face of accusation. This is not easy for someone whose identity was built around care, but it is necessary. Over time, something shifts. The guilt begins to loosen its grip. The kind one realizes that protecting their well-being does not harm others. It simply removes an unhealthy resource. They begin to feel lighter, clearer, less reactive, and in that clarity, They understand that betrayal was never the act of setting boundaries. The betrayal was expecting someone to abandon themselves indefinitely. This is the turning point, because boundaries do not destroy families. They expose what was already fragile. They do not create distance, they reveal it. And when the kind one stands firm, calmly and consistently, the system is forced to confront a reality it avoided. Connection without control requires respect, and respect can no longer be negotiated through guilt. The moment the demon loses power in broken family systems does not collapse with noise. It dissolves in silence, clarity, and withdrawal of participation. The moment the kind one stops explaining, stops proving, and stops seeking permission to exist as they are, something profound shifts. Not externally at first, but internally, and that internal shift is where the demon begins to lose its grip. For a long time, the system fed on reaction, on emotional engagement, on the kind one's willingness to respond, clarify, defend, and repair. Every explanation offered was treated as evidence to be debated. Every emotion expressed was treated as material to be reshaped or dismissed. The kind one believed that if they could just be understood, things would change. But understanding was never the goal. Access was. The loss of power begins when the kind one recognizes this truth without bitterness. They stop trying to correct false narratives. They stop chasing fairness in spaces that profit from confusion. Silence, in this phase, is not avoidance. It is discernment. It is the refusal to hand over emotional energy to a system that has already shown how it will use it. What replaces explanation is consistency, calm, predictability. The kind one does not announce their awakening. They simply behave differently. They respond less, share less, engage selectively. They respond less, share less, engage selectively. And this shift is deeply unsettling to the system because it removes leverage. Without emotional reactions, there is nothing to manipulate. Without access, there is nothing to control. The demon loses power when the kind one stops internalizing blame. Self-reflection turns into self-trust. They no longer ask, "What did I do wrong?" every time tension appears. Instead, they ask, "Is this mine to carry?" This question changes everything. It interrupts old reflexes, it creates pause, and in that pause, old patterns fail to activate. This stage is often misunderstood by outsiders. It can look like distance, like detachment, like indifference. But internally, it is integration. The kind one is no longer fragmented, no longer split between who they are and who they are expected to be. They act from alignment rather than fear. And alignment is something dysfunctional systems cannot penetrate. The system may respond with confusion, subtle provocation, or attempts to re-engage the old roles. Familiar guilt may resurface. Old narratives may be repeated with urgency, but they land differently now. The kind one hears them without absorbing them, observes without reacting. This is not coldness. It is emotional sovereignty. Power drains away when the kind one no longer needs validation from those who benefit from their self-doubt. Approval loses its hold. Disapproval loses its sting. The emotional hooks that once pulled them into endless loops of explanation simply stop working. And when a system cannot provoke a response, it reveals its emptiness. There is a quiet grief in this stage, not for what was, but for what was never possible. The kind one mourns the idea of a family that could meet them with the same depth they offered. This grief is honest, and it is necessary. It allows them to release hope that was being used against them, and in releasing it, they reclaim energy that was trapped in waiting. The demon truly loses power when the kind one stops being predictable, not in behavior, but in availability. They are no longer the emotional constant others rely on to stabilize chaos. They do not rush in to fix, soothe, or absorb. They allow discomfort to exist without rescuing it, and this forces the system to confront consequences it once avoided. What remains is choice. The kind one chooses where to invest their empathy, chooses which conversations deserve energy, chooses distance without hostility, and presence without self-erasure. This choice is the final break in the chain, because power rooted in entitlement cannot survive where choice is respected. In this moment, the demon does not disappear dramatically. It fades. It becomes irrelevant. It has nothing left to feed on, no guilt to activate, no reaction to harvest, no confusion to exploit. The kind one stands quietly outside the pattern, not hardened, not bitter, but awake. And that is the ending no broken system prepares for. Not rebellion, not revenge, but freedom.